It's soft, slightly sweet, and very rich, full of butter, eggs, and milk. It's one of my favorite breads due to its versatility. It's brioche. Let's get cooking. So before we can even think about making these sliders, the first thing we need to do is activate the yeast. For this recipe, we're going to be using active dry yeast, which is technically asleep/dormant. So into the bowl of my stand mixer goes a half cup of milk that has been warmed anywhere between 100 degrees to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything below 100 degrees, the yeast isn't going to activate, and anything over 110, you're just going to end up killing it, and we don't want to do that. We want it to wake up and cause some carbon dioxide goodness. So think about it, the milk is actually kind of like a really warm blanket when you wake up on a cold winter's day. Next, we're going to be adding in 2 teaspoons of honey. This is going to be kind of like the breakfast in bed, because when these microorganisms wake up, they're going to be a little bit hungry, and they need to eat in order to start, again, creating that carbon dioxide goodness. So now they have the warm bed that they can wake up in, breakfast that they can start munching on right away, and now it's just time to add in our boys. Look at these boys, so handsome. But in all seriousness, we're adding 1 package, which is the equivalent of 2 1/4 teaspoons. And then instead of allowing them to wake up peacefully, like, oh, no, we're gonna whisk them together and force them to wake up. But be gentle. You don't wanna hurt the boys, all right? Be gentle. So after you're done giving them the whiskey business, it's time to just let them chill out for about 10 to 15 minutes and let them do their thing. The yeast is going to start eating away at the sugar, which in return releases carbon dioxide, and that creates nice bubbly sensations. So this is what you get after 15 minutes. You can see it has really bubbled up and foamed up on the top, meaning that our boys are active and they're ready to play. So now into the mixing bowl, we're going to be adding in 4 whole large eggs plus 2 additional yolks. Now I went ahead and just kind of whisked these up in the bowl just so that it makes the next step a little bit easier when we're making the rough dough. After the eggs, we're adding in 5 tablespoons or 2.1 ounces of white granulated sugar. The next ingredient that we're going to be adding is 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract. But why are we adding vanilla? The vanilla is actually going to help kind of eliminate some of that eggy flavor that you might find in the bread. We just added 6 eggs into it. And then after the vanilla comes a little more whiskey mixy business. My favorite thing ever. Alright, so moving on to the dry ingredients. Into the bowl, we're adding 4 cups plus 2 tablespoons or 17.6 ounces of all-purpose flour into the bowl. After the flour, we're adding 1.5 teaspoons of sea salt. Using a rubber spatula, just mixing everything together to kind of form a rough dough. In the end, it's going to look like this. Now it's time to break out the stand mixer with the dough hook attachment. Let's go. Next step is letting it knead together on a low speed for about 5 minutes, just until a nice dough forms. Now brioche wouldn't be brioche without the butter. What I have here is 8.8 ounces of unsalted butter, or roughly 2 sticks plus an additional 2 tablespoons of a 3rd stick. The butter is going to be added into 4 separate portions. So for the first one, adding a few of those knobs, letting it mix for roughly 2 minutes, then scraping down the bowl, adding in more butter, scraping it down, adding in more butter, scraping it down, adding in more butter, and then bam, all your butter is incorporated. It's going to take roughly 9 to 10 minutes to incorporate all the butter if you're mixing it correctly. At the end of mixing, you're going to be left with this. It's going to be kind of like a cake batter consistency, but do not fret. What you see me doing here is kind of just scraping out the sides and the bottom of the bowl for the next step. So to touch back on the cake batter consistency, adding butter into the dough actually inhibits gluten formation. But we can get that gluten to form by, you guessed it, beating the dough for roughly 20 minutes on a high speed. You will know that you have enough gluten formation when your dough turns from this cake batter consistency into a nice tight dough that has a nice little shine. It's nice and satiny and it looks beautiful. So now it's time to shape our dough. The first thing I'm doing is putting a nice light coating of all-purpose flour onto the board, and make sure you cover your hands in it to prevent the dough from sticking to your hands. Then scoop the dough from the bowl onto the board. So now moving on to shaping. What I'm doing here is grabbing all of the sides of the dough and pulling them into the middle, pressing them down. Then flipping the dough over so that seam we just made is on the bottom. That was kind of rough, I apologize, Mr. Dough Ball. Then using the palm of my hands, I am scraping the dough against the table in a pulling kind of back motion. Now friction is going to be our best friend here. The two things that we're looking for. On the top, it's going to turn nice and tight. On the bottom, that seam that we made from folding all those edges over is going to close. Now we're going to repeat this until again you get a nice tight top and that seam disappears on the bottom. Now don't be afraid if you notice that your dough is kind of sticking to the table. Again, that is friction working, that is going to only help us close that seam. So as you can see here, we have a nice tight dough ball. Now the next step is to put it back into the mixing bowl, because now we're going to let it proof. So now that it's back in the bowl, what I'm doing is covering the top with plastic wrap. Now for proofing, I do recommend that you stick this somewhere warm in your kitchen or in your house, roughly about 72 degrees. What I did was I turned my oven onto the warm setting and just set that mixing bowl right on top of my oven. Now what you're looking for is the dough to at least double in size. And again, we're gonna let this go for an hour.
A few moments later.
So yeah, comment down below what you did during your hour break. I'm very curious to know. But what you're looking at is our boys get into work. As you can see here, our dough has risen and it is quite jiggly. Alright, so now that initial proof is out of the way, it is time for us to once again reshape this dough. So the steps for the second shaping are the same as the first one. The only thing that's different is as soon as the dough gets out onto the board, we're going to lay it out flat and try to get as much air out of the dough as possible. Kind of like when a football coach smacks a player on the butt, that's essentially what we're doing to our boys for doing such a good job raising our dough. But again, the process is the same. Folding all the sides into the middle, pressing it, flipping it over, and then using the palm of our hands to shape that dough into, once again, a nice tight ball. So once the ball is shaped, it's going to go back into the mixing bowl, more plastic wrap on top, and now we're going to put this into the refrigerator. This is called the overnight proof. This process is very important to proofing. Right now, our yeast is very excited, they're very happy, they're having a lot of fun, they're eating, enjoying themselves. But we need to slow them down a little bit, pace them out. Putting the dough into the refrigerator actually slows the rise down. Now the yeast is still working, but it's actually working at a slower rate. Now we get one benefit from this, and the benefit is flavor. The longer the dough ferments, the more chance of bacteria and enzymes getting to work and unlocking the different flavors located inside of the wheat. Plus, it allows you to bake the bread at a later time. You should do this overnight proof for at least 8 hours, but no longer than 24 hours. Alright, it's the next day and it's time to get back to work. Just pulled this out of the refrigerator and I had it in the refrigerator for at least 12 hours. I will not lie to you, I was definitely asleep those entire 12 hours. But now it's time for fun. We're going to turn that big dough ball into a bunch of small dough balls. For this video, I'm going to be making sliders that I'm going to be using in a later video. So make sure you watch out for that one. But now it's time to take our dough out of the mixing bowl and onto a lightly floured work surface. And I will say the smell coming out of this dough was absolutely wonderful. Alright, I'm finally able to use my bench scraper that I've had sitting in my drawer for so long. All I'm doing here is taking that big dough ball, cutting it in half directly in the middle, and taking one half, setting it off to the side, and covering it with a towel just so it doesn't dry out. Next, using a scale, we're going to cut little chunks out of that dough ball in hopes of getting balls that are about 50 grams a piece. Using a scale here for this step is very beneficial as it will make sure that all your balls are consistent, they're all the same weight, all the same size. Repeat this process until you have cut out all the dough balls out of both halves of the dough. So now it's time to shape them. This process follows the same steps that we took to shape the big dough ball, but slightly altered. Flatten the dough out, tuck in all the corners into the middle, flip it over, and then to shape, instead of using a pull back motion, we're going to use our hands like a nice tight cage around the dough ball and spin it in circles. When done correctly, you're going to be left with a nice tight dough ball on the top, and that bottom seam, just like we were shaping our big ones, is going to be nice and closed. Kind of like this. Look at that. Repeat this process until all your dough balls are formed, and then place them onto a baking tray that has been lined with parchment paper. Make sure to evenly space them out. For here, I kept mine a little bit closer because I'm going for a more pull apart style. So now there's one more proofing to go before we can bake these bad boys. So pretending my towel is a blanket and tucking them in, we're going to set this into a warm spot for up to 2 hours until they proof up. So after 2 hours, I'm using my finger to make a small indent into the dough, and if it springs back slowly at you, your dough is ready to bake. And then the very last step before putting these buns into the oven is to coat them in a little bit of an egg wash. All I did here was take one egg, crack it open into a little bowl, whisk it together, add a little splash of water, and then brush it onto the top of each bun. And then because I'm feeling fancy, I just sprinkle a little bit of sesame seeds on top. You can use white sesame seeds, black sesame seeds, or if you want to get real fancy, everything bagel seasoning. And this is what they look like. So into an oven at 350 degrees, we're going to bake these for 10 to 12 minutes until golden brown on top and the internal temperature registers 200 degrees. Once out of the oven, let them sit on the tray for at least 15 minutes to cool slightly, and then transfer them to a wire mesh rack and let them cool to completion. And not to brag, but for my first time baking buns at home, these look amazing. I'm very proud of myself. But the most important part, making sure that internal crumb looks amazing, which it does. Nice job, Bailey. So there you have it, brioche buns. Now it might take a lot of time, patience, and requires a lot of love, but in the end, it's all worth it. So stay tuned for more upcoming content, and as always, thank you so much for liking, commenting, and subscribing, and I will see you on the next one. Take care.